I am the project leader at Rethink. Rethink is a foundation that rethinks cities. And this event is part of WeMakeThe.City. And today is a special program called Architecture of Hope. And we're lucky to have 3 doctors speaking this evening, doctors in their field. So we are going to look at ways that architecture and urban planning can bring hope to this world, because displacement has been, is, and will be a very big issue in the world. Climate change, natural causes, disasters, war, also economic and class struggles bring people to places suddenly. And this evening we're going to look at 3 different parts. One is planning for the future, one that looks at present realities, and one reflects on the past and tries to find ways of seeing how we can use that knowledge in the future. We are going to see how we can work together on things. So we have speakers who have experience in many parts of the globe. And I know that many professionals, I'm not a professional in the field, don't like the word displacement design, but for me, it makes sense. It makes me understand that if you have displaced people, you don't have to always only react, how do you make them survive and manage, but how can you make them thrive? And that everyone has the right to have a home, and a home means more than a cover on top of your head. We're going to start with planning for the future. We're going to have like a time machine going backwards. So we'll hear about a project in Almere preparing for climate change. The structure of the evening is that we have 3 speakers. Each will speak about their different subject. Then we have time for question and answers after each speaker. And in the end, we will have a panel where we will see how can we work together, other ways to learn from each other, work together, share knowledge, and share even maybe projects. Nearly half of us globally live within an hour of a coast. If you look at the factors that drove our evolution as humans, a lot of them were coastal. There are lots of resources on the coast. The square mileage of the areas that have been exposed during human history, which are now under the sea, is equal to that of North America. So for 95% of the time that humans have existed, sea levels have been lower than they are now, usually by about 130 feet. At their lowest, they were about 400 feet lower globally than they are today. Aquaterra is what some archaeologists refer to the area, the land, that has been inhabited and then covered by the sea. And how do we deal with climate change today? Are we going to turn to multiple aquaterras? We're going to start with our first speaker, Mr. Flourish Almarri. He's the government architect of the Netherlands. He's an architect, urban designer, and partner at Office for Metropolitan Architects and head of FAA, Flourish Almarri Architect. Almarri has left his mark in different countries, among others in the development of around Lille in France, the Ruhr Museum in Essen, Germany, and the new city center of Almere in the Netherlands. For 5 years, Almarri has been our government architect. He monitors and promotes the architectural and urban planning quality of the government projects in the Netherlands. And the government architect offers advice on architectural quality as well as major spatial themes. He also plays an important role in the informing of the professional discourse, which this is part of. On his Netherlands government architect's agenda, he has included the ambition to search for the social value of every design challenge. So, Mr. Almarri, the floor is yours, and he's going to share with us a pilot in Almere. Welcome. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you for the invitation, and indeed I will tell you about the project we are planning to do in the city of Almere. But before I go to Almere, I'll try to explain you how we got there and why we were thinking about what we called the program Building for the World. It has to do, of course, a lot with, like I already told, about displacement. And in our world, many people are displaced. So are my slides currently, apparently. Not sure what I should... It's working, yeah. Well, the numbers, I think you've all seen them. It's amazing. 65 million people displaced, depending on how you calculate it, the people where they come from. And to realize that this is a reality for many, many people. And what does it mean? And how do you gain dignity? How do you gain self-esteem once you're in such a situation? So harsh, so difficult, and for everybody a question how to survive and where to go to. If you look at what happens to the world, all these numbers, it's only a very small percentage of it that we actually see, witness in our own societies. And this is, of course, what we happened to see in Europe in 2015, when we had an influx of refugees. And, of course, then the question is what to do, how to act. And I always like to see, okay, but of course the politicians have a responsibility, civilians have a responsibility. But what does the creative class do? What do the designers do? And that is a question, how to act. Of course, you can have your charity diners, raising money, raising awareness. But what does it really change? Is this the way to act? Or like Ai did in Germany, the life jackets, expose them, show what the reality for many people is. But these, of course, are projects, interesting, well-intended, but are they the things that will change? Are they the things that will change the real world in real time? Because this is how people react, this is how countries react. Close borders, make sure that your own life, your own lifestyle is not being affected by forces, by trouble in other parts of the world. That's what we saw in the Netherlands. And of course we have seen this picture a lot. It's a frightening picture. People protesting against the refugees coming to the Netherlands. It has to be said that much more people in the Netherlands welcomed refugees. But it is a debate how to act. To me, I try to understand the people on the right side. So why were they protesting? Why was it that they were so angry? Basically, it was because they said, well, we want the houses, we need houses, and now the refugees come and they get the houses we wanted. So I said, maybe it's not so much a refugee crisis in the Netherlands, but a housing crisis. And that, of course, has to do with the way we construct houses in the Netherlands. We do build houses, beautiful houses, high-quality houses, but the houses are very, very expensive. The most expensive houses in Europe, if you look at the income. Greece is more expensive, but that only has to do with the fact that the income in Greece has dropped quite a bit. And then the answer, of course, goes into this direction. Temporary houses, the container dwellings as they are nicknamed. And to me that is a shame. I think this is not the way that the receiving community should house refugees. Of course it's a cheap way, it's a flexible way. But then again, if you look at it, it's not that cheap. And that has to do with the fact that these container dwellings, you have to construct them, which is a lot of money. Then if you're not using them, they have to store them, which is a lot of money. If you need them, you need to transport them, which is a lot of money. And then you have to make all the infrastructures, electricity, water, sewer, etc. It's again a lot of money. So if you look at these dwellings, only 1/3 of the costs is in the dwelling itself. 2/3 is all the extras you have. And then again, they're so ugly that no matter where you build them, the community will say, the sooner they go, the better. So you're creating a kind of ghetto simply by making them so horrible. And that is something to think about, because people need to integrate. And you see, as soon as people start to meet, interact, they can integrate. But if you bring them in a position where actually people think, well, the earlier you're gone, the better, then they have no fair chance. Especially because these dwellings usually then are built in the outskirts of the city. And to me also surprising was that how many empty buildings we have in the Netherlands. There's a lot of vacant buildings. So I said, why not use the vacant buildings? Netherlands has plenty of space. But then also not only using the empty buildings, old offices, etc., for housing refugees, but I said, let's think of systems where you not only take care of the refugees, but also for everybody else who need a flexible house, a cheap house, like students, like expats, like people who are just divorced or people who are just not having enough money. So I said, it's actually almost a philosophical question, a political question. How do you design with uncertainty if the influx is so unpredictable as with refugees? And the answer is actually quite simple. Just make the group you design for broader. So if you say we make flexible houses, cheap houses, different kind of houses, good quality houses, but then make them for a much wider group. And if you do that, then the refugee question becomes not part of a problem, but then it becomes part of the solution for many more people. So can you reframe the refugee question not as part of a problem, but as part of the solution? And that's why we organized a competition. In this case, we did it together with COA, the refugee institution. And we called it the Home Away from Home. Can we find a way to provide better houses? And we had more targets. So we said very important to make sure that we're not only working for asylum seekers, make it for everybody. Let's simply rethink the way we build houses. And not only small houses, but also the reuse of vacant buildings. There are so many vacant buildings in the Netherlands, currently a bit less in the Randstad, but there are still plenty of empty spaces. And add design power to it. Rethink houses and try to realize prototypes so that you can show what is happening. And we had an enormous amount of people responding to it. It was interesting to see how willing people are to rethink houses, to work in a positive way with the refugee questions. Like, what can we do? So many ideas. And also interesting to see how fast projects can go. Because between the first announcement of the competition and realizing the prototypes, only 9 months. And so we realized prototypes scale 1-to-1. At the Dutch Design Week in Eindhoven, we presented them. And as you can see, these are cheap, flexible houses. And they're very sustainable, made out of wood. And as you can see, they look really good. This is not the kind of houses you're used with container dwellings. And these, they're more expensive than the metal ones. If you look at the cost you have to invest to make them. But if you realize that these houses you can put somewhere and you have no need to displace them once the refugees have found another house, but you can put a student in it or what else, then you have all these transport costs, etc., no longer. And also, these houses, they last for 50 years easily, much longer than the metal ones. So in the long term, this is something you can invest in. Interesting, at the moment we presented that in 9 months, there was the deal with Turkey, and so the refugee influx stopped in the Netherlands. But we were confronted with a lot of people who asked us, but can we buy these as holiday homes? So all of a sudden there was this completely different agenda. That's also what design can do. With this, we raised a lot of attention. So all of a sudden I got an invitation to present our project, A Home Away from Home, at the United Nations in New York. And so we could explain what we were doing and what way we were thinking. And at that moment, a minister of Jordan came to me and she said, what we need is a toolbox of ideas. What can we do in order to generate houses for all the refugees coming to our country? And that's of course something we start thinking about, like how can we work with it? And we started to collaborate with the VNGI on a resilience program, and they were working in Lebanon and in Jordan. So it was a running program where we were working together with. Very interesting program. And we're thinking about, okay, let's think about new typologies for houses. And there is an interesting debate. Of course, there's people saying, well, as soon as these people come, do realize that this is the beginning of a new form of urbanism. The refugees come and their camps, and if you treat them well, they can make cities out of it. And that's true if these people are wanted. But most of the time, and depends a lot on the circumstances, the government says, well, we don't want these people to stay. In many African cities, the slums are the beginning of urbanism. These people can build up a life, can build up a city. In Lebanon, we talked to the minister, and he said, no matter what, these people have to go back to Syria. And of course, if you look at the situation in Lebanon, 40% of the population is refugees. 40. And that's an amazing amount of people. And this minister said, no way that these camps will become official cities. They have to go back. Which puts the question in a completely different context. So you cannot make proper housing, because then the camps will become too attractive. Also important to realize, like in Lebanon, that about 80% of the refugees are not in camps. They're living in the urban areas. So they find ways to live in the cities. The other 20% are camps. And we did this program in the BK Valley. A very grim reality next to the Syrian border. And visiting these camps, then you start to see indeed that they cannot build houses. They're not allowed to build houses. These are camps where people are living for many years on a row. But looking at it, you see also that they manage to have a certain quality of life. And also there is electricity often. I visited these houses and they had airco in there and kitchens. So somehow it's not that there is nothing. And hard to understand what the best way is to act. How can you help? We met the mayor of Razé, one of the partners of the program, the resilience program, and he was an interesting character, and he explained the situation quite clearly. He said, in my village we have about 15,000 inhabitants, and in the camps surrounding my village live about 40,000 refugees. So about almost 3 times the population of the village. And he said, I see all these aid workers coming in and they're helping the refugees. Now, there's medical support, there's food, there is education. But do you realize what it means for the local population to have all these camps here? And he was afraid that even pogroms might arise. And he said, and he had an interesting idea. It may be born out of self-interest, but rightfully so. And he said, I want to build a park between my village and the camps. And that's a place where people can meet. And if the refugees go back, then we still have a park. And then something we built where our village has a profit from. But on the same time, when the camps are still there, this is the place where people can interact. And it was a weird way of thinking, but because we thought we need to do housing. But then all of a sudden I realized that the real way to act might indeed be to start with the park. So we did some sketches, some tests to see, okay, but how can this park look? There was a park which he already started with, although it didn't look very much like a park yet. But so we made some designs, we tested it, we worked together with the University of Beirut, and they set up a program to consult the local people on the park. It was funny to see that the local inhabitants, but also the people living in the camps, not thinking about war, not thinking about whatever, but thinking about what kind of park do you want. Strange rethinking, reframing, and all of a sudden it actually happened. And then in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, it's gates, walls everywhere. Here we managed to convince the people to take down the walls, to open up the park. And there was a lot of schools linked to the park, but completely isolated. So also the walls between the schools and the park are gone. And this is a program actually also done with refugees working on the park. So all of a sudden the refugees help to increase the quality in the village. So it's working very interesting. And this is actually a park, I just heard that it's almost finished now. So for me, completely unexpected that this was the way to act, but I think a smart way. And part of the program, the resilience program, is a recycling program. So we still think, and we hope we can realize it, maybe not in this place, but another place, that the garbage that is collected can be recycled in new ways of smart houses. To be seen if we can set up such a program. But so we didn't start with the houses, we started with the other end. And that has to do with the context, and that I think is something you always need to realize. There are different contexts. If you look at the Hurricane Irma, it's a different question. Of course, houses are demolished, but this is not for a population that is displaced. This is a population that has to rebuild. But in this case, difficult situation, corrupted government, which the Dutch government says we won't give you money directly, etc. Another context. But the question, of course, is how to act, how to build. A lot of ideas, smart design solutions. But to me, always the question, is smart design solution the best way to act? I once gave a lecture, I think 2 years from now ago, in Mumbai. And part of the program I did was visiting some slum areas, Dharavi. And my guide was a student who grew up in these slums. And he was a smart guy, very interesting guy. And he took me there and he asked me, okay, what do you see? And I said, well, I see something that definitely could be improved. This is not what I see as healthy living conditions. And he said, you're wrong. You're totally wrong. You haven't seen anything. You don't understand what's happening here. And he said, I'll show you the slums and I'll explain you the quality of it. And he said, if you're in India, you're living on the countryside and you want to make money, you want to earn a living, you go to the city, but you have no money whatsoever. So all these people arrive in the slums, and there you can survive without money. And the way to survive is to work. In the slums, there's work. People make businesses. And he told me that within 10 years, and then you have to work really hard, in 10 years you earn enough money to buy a house. And that still will be a very small, difficult house, but 10 years. And he said a lot of people, youngsters, come to the town, to the slums. They see what kind of business they can raise. They phone home to their village. The village start produce goods and they trade it in the city. So he said what you see as a problem to be solved is for many Indian people the solution. And in India, 60% of the population is living in slums. And if you walk around there, it's unbelievable. These people make everything out of everything. And they collect whatever materials they can grab from the garbage heaps. And they make things. Huh? And they make it very good. They make it smart. They have all the technologies. They have humor. The people are good humored. And they're working. But you see, nevertheless, this is not a solution in every aspect. You need to organize sanitation. You need to organize sewers. You need to organize healthcare. There's a lot of things to be organized. But the important lesson is to learn that people themselves can do so many things if they have just a little help. It's not that we as Western people should come there and tell them, okay, we will solve your problems. First of all, you have to learn and to observe, to analyze what are these people doing, what do they want, what can they do, and then see what you can add. And that's actually why we came to this program, Building for the World, in collaboration with different ministries, also with the Dutch agency, the Rijksvastgoedbedrijf. We did it together with Crimson. Michel will talk later about another project, but also with them we worked on this program. Basically, project plan, seeing if we could make a terrain in Almere, in the Floriade, to see where the systems that we invented, the systems that we learned of, could be embedded. Floriade, which of course has another program, but it's very interesting to combine the Floriade as a kind of event with this issue of building for the world. So for that we're in the process of selecting locations to see different parts of the world. Like I said, different parts, different contexts will have different answers, to see who we can work with, working with the local people, not telling them what to do, but learning what they need. Having a certain set of themes to work with. So it's not just about housing, it's all the extras that is often much more critical to work with. And in that sense, 3 sections. One context is indeed, if these slums are part of the first step of urbanization, like in many African cities, how can you work with it? And how can you upgrade it? What do you need to do? What kind of safety? What kind of sanitation? It's a specific set of questions, so that will be the first domain. Second domain is indeed climate, hurricanes, other systems that disrupt cities. How do you work with it? It's a different question. This is about smart building techniques, maybe reuse of other materials, find ways to build in a way that they can withstand the enormous forces of hurricanes and maybe floodings to be worked with. And the third category is what do you do in camps where the people are not wanted? And that is maybe the most difficult thing, because people can build up everything, they're smart. But if they're not wanted, if they're illegal, if they are temporarily, if they know you have to go, that's not a stable basis to live in. But how do you survive? So this is by every means the most difficult category we also want to work on. What kind of houses, what kind of things can you offer there? So that in short is the program Building for the World. We are going to hope to realize in the future in the city of Almere as a kind of demonstration, as a testing ground for many principles. But like I said, a testing ground in collaboration with local parties. Because I think that's in the end where it's all about. It's not techniques, it's not materials. It is about dignity and about the self-esteem of the people. How can you generate that? And that has to do with how you act, how you take your responsibility, how you put design power. But most of all, how do you listen to the people living there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an eye-opener. I still don't see how Almere is that. Almere will solve everything. For you who don't know, maybe you can tell us a few words how Almarri was built.
Yeah, Almere actually is the city that could not exist actually if the Netherlands wasn't so smart in controlling the sea. It's reclaimed land. It used to be the sea, so it's on the bottom of the sea. And it's a new town. I think it was first buildings in something 1975. And it's one of the fastest growing cities in Europe. It's amazing how fast these cities are growing. And it's the one family ground-bound house paradise. This is where people find their happiness, you could say. And a lot of people of Amsterdam who no longer can afford to live in Amsterdam end up in Almere. And that's what Almere is. It's a new town and it's trying to struggle to define its own identity. And the nice thing is that everybody loves to hate Almere. And despite that, there's something growing in Almere, an own identity, even pride. And in that sense, I think this could be a beautiful next step to promote Almere as a city that takes care of other people.
So it's a kind of like a backward, usually people come to the cities and then the city has slums and Amsterdammers are walking backwards to Almere to live and
yeah, you could say Almere is the future of Amsterdam, maybe. That, yeah.
Okay. I have a few questions. If anyone from the audience wants to start, I will take that. But okay, I will ask. Yeah, please.
Is this actually going to be part of the Floriade, Floris, or is it there because Almere is also doing the Floriade? Is it really part of that Floriade project?
Yeah, that's our intention, to make it really part of Floriade. And, but it's also our intention that when the Floriade goes, this stays. So that is maybe also a yearly event that we ask students to improve typologies. And that like every year we build something else, something new. And so the Floriade comes and goes, this question stays. And I think it's beautiful to have kind of demonstration grounds where we can prove. And the site we have is next to the highway in an area that is very muddy. So the city said maybe it's not the best site because there's a risk of flooding. There's a risk that... I said, okay, but this is exactly the site we need. This is what reality is. So make our life as difficult as possible and then we'll have the best possible site.
Yeah. A couple of words about Floriade, please.
Well, the Floriade is a typical Dutch event. It's not on a very regular basis. It's, I believe, every 10 years or so. And it's basically an exhibition on gardens, on plants, on food production. It's a very touristical event. And different cities can organize it. And this time Almere has put itself forward to organize it. 2022, I think it's will be there. And difficult, because finance is always an issue here. So not sure in what way, how it will be presented. It will be there. And but then again, I think the good thing is that this program, Building for the World, can run with and without the Floriade, but will be part of it. And I think it's beautiful that it's not only about beautiful flowers, but about beautiful refugee questions. Yeah.
So you will be building kind of little town as a model.
Yeah, so I think like the 3 sections, we were, because the questions are so different, so let's also test them in different ways. And I had an interesting conversation with the mayor of Almere, Mr. Weerwind, and he said that maybe we should have a 4th category, and that is building cheap houses, not for the other parts of the world, but for the poor people in Almere and the poor people in Amsterdam. For like, what can we do also for our own population? Because can't we invent houses that are cheap, high quality, affordable, flexible, etc. So, so maybe there will be a 4th category, and then it really becomes building for the world. Yeah.
I'm going to ask something, but we can discuss it during the panel because it's a bigger question. Like in a small country like the Netherlands and in many countries, the expensive thing is the land. And many, for instance, refugees have been spread all over the Holland, and the ones who don't live in a city, who already come from somewhere else, are the most, depressed. They are the least to have a job. They are, it's hard for them to go on. So one interesting thing would be, how do you build how do you fill the vacant places? How do you make communities and not only build like beautiful individual homes?
In the end, it's a social question. But to be precise, in Almere, we are not building houses where people will live in. It's a demonstration model to test housing typologies. And what we will build will be in the local communities we select the areas with. So it's a dual project, testing in Almere, building somewhere in the world. And indeed, the social questions are always the key questions. And that, like I showed you in the BK Valley in Lebanon, that in the end, the public park is the first step rather than to repair the roof. It's a different mindset that you need.
Yeah.
And but indeed, the Netherlands is a small country, but it has enough space to take some refugees also in our own land. Yeah.
Yeah. Any more questions here?
Thank you. Thank you for the nice talk. I just read an article that Eigenhaard is now importing prefab housing from South Africa to use them as housing here because it's cheaper. It's like 15% cheaper. Do you feel that is similar to the containers you showed, or is it an improvement?
I don't know what typology this is, but I would rather say import the ideas, improve them and build them yourselves, because shipping houses all around the world doesn't look very sustainable to me. And to me the question is, can we build cheap houses with high standards so that it's good for everybody? And but maybe in South Africa they invented a typology which is smart, cheap, etc. I don't know.
I understand that in Almere there is at the Cascade Park building from Nader Khalili, which is probably very interesting also as a typology, the Adobe building. So that could be included, that is already there, neighbor house, and very interesting setup.
We will definitely look at that, and we can include it in the system, in the demonstration projects. And because materialization is very important, I hope we can combine it with very sustainable ways of building, constructing. So no metal, no concrete, build it in wood, maybe build it in dirt and earth systems. Finding ways to deal with that, and it is a combination of design power and kind of organization that we try to set up there. And, but we try to learn from every good idea that already is developed, whether it's South Africa or the other one you mentioned.
Thank you very much. We have more time for more questions in the end, in the panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, from Almere we go, as Mr. Al-Kamari mentioned, that as of 2018, 68.5 million people were forcibly displaced, some in camps, just barely meeting their basic needs. In the second part, we're going to speak about, among other things, refugee camps. Every 1 in 4 refugees is a Palestinian. So we have someone who is both professionally and by belonging part of this question. Our next speaker, Ms. Sandy Hilal, is an architect and researcher and co-founder of DAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Residence. Hilal was the head of the Infrastructure and Camp Improvement Program in the West Bank at UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And Palestinians are used to this long sentence. Hilal and Alessandro Petti co-authored the book Architecture After Revolution, an invitation to rethink today's struggles for justice and equality, also as processes of decolonization. Also, together with Alessandro Petti, she founded Campus in Camps, an experimental educational program hosted in Dheshi refugee camp in Bethlehem, with the aims to overcome conventional educational structures. She's had lots of other experiences and projects around the world. And Miss Sandy Hilal, the floor is yours. The websites are here. Yeah. Yes.
Anyway. Well, sometimes I find it difficult when I have 15 minutes to speak about 15 years of work and life, but I will try my best. And actually, I thought that I will be trying to do it this way. I mean, it's a provocation, and I would like us, especially being here, to think together. And in that sense, if you would think about the power of architecture, architecture all the time actually gave shape to ideologies. So in that sense, architecture gave shape to fascism, it gave shapes to modern state, gave shapes to many other, make spatial manifestation of ideologies. And in that sense, I guess what I would like to do today is to invite architects to think what kind of shape we are giving to displacement and refugeehood. And in that sense, is the knowledge that we have enough for us to react and to give ideologies, or we think that, displacement, refugees, permanent people do not deserve actually to have a special manifestation, yet the only thing that they deserve from us is to react to. So in that sense, if we have displacement people, we will react by smart design. If we will have this, we will react by smart reaction, while we never, as architects, and I have to say that I make part of this architecture clan, we never as architects actually engage in what kind of architecture forms we are giving to displacement and how this is actually being used and being part of building the ideologies around displacement. In order to do so, actually, I have to say that I should go back very quickly to, Umayya mentioned that I was appointed as a head camp improvement program, which is a program in 2006 was actually launched by the UN with this idea of improving refugee camps. And in that sense, if you look at Palestinian refugee camps, they are 70 years old. We are speaking about 4th generation. And they thought maybe it's time to think about improving of refugee camps. And I was invited to head the research of understanding what does it mean to improve refugee camp. And I arrived to 3 camps in the south of the West Bank, but particularly I would speak about the Dheshi refugee camp. And when I had to enter and begin my talk with the community, they stopped me for 2 years, 2 entire years. And you know why they stopped me? They say, first, we clarify what do you mean by improvement, and then either we welcome you to come in or you are out of this question. So in that sense, the whole question was, why do we need today to improve refugee camps that have 70 years in a place where refugees for 70 years refuse normalization, refuse to stay where they are, and they struggle in order to come back home? Knowing that, of course, they need dignity to be in a place. It's very important for them to understand how they live every day in a dignity matter. But in a sense, all their request was, we are still political subjects and we don't let anyone treat us rather than insisting on the fact that we are political subjects. We own our political cause and we want to understand what is the camp today and how we can deal with it. And in that sense, after 2 years of work, 2 years of discussing with them and of proving also that I am completely open and actually also showing what architecture might be doing, I entered in and began to work together with my partner. That in that moment he was teaching in the university, and most of his brilliant students were from refugee camp. And this is why we thought that we need, and he thought, I mean, he felt that the island the campus he was teaching in was completely separated from the campus, where there was a lot of knowledge to deal with. And today I would like to take you through maybe 4 very important concepts for me that we, at this point, we feel that we really need to come back to basics. We need to come back to understand how we unlearn, because we felt that mainly what we were needing in that moment is how to unlearn what we learned already, how to think that we know everything about displacement, refugees, reactions, smart solutions, rather than to rethink basics. And in that sense, the basics I would like to rethink together with you today about is permanent temporariness, private, public, campus and camps, concrete tent. And, let me try to take you, first of all, with this idea of permanent temporariness. And in order to do so, actually, by the way, this is what also Umayya asked me to speak about in particular. In order to do so, we decided to establish a university in a refugee camp. We call it Campus in Camps. And the whole idea was how to bring knowledge from the university to the camp and the other way around, how to understand the camp from a new different perspective. And this will take me immediately to the private and public notions. And if you think about refugee camps, in refugee camps there is no private and there is no public the way we understand it today in our contemporary society. And this is alone actually should open our eyes completely, because in a refugee camp where people live 70 years, imagine living 70 years beyond the 2 notions of private and public that we cannot imagine our society without, because refugees in Palestinian refugee camps do not own their own houses. They have only the right to use. In the same moment, they have no municipality to take care of their public, and it is a place where people are completely self-organized. Even, working in UNRWA, the only thing that and we were mapping the camp, and they were so worried that by mapping the camp, we are claiming ourselves as UN, as administrator of the refugee camp, because the UN says very clearly, we are only providing services to refugee camps. We do not administrate the camp. Therefore, we are not equal to a municipality. Imagine people managing to live for 70 years beyond notions of private and public. And in that sense, when we were walking in the camps, both me and my partner, we are both PhDs in architecture, we said, we don't have any meaning of understanding what is it that we are seeing in front of us? What is it? How there is a community that is living today beyond private and public? And therefore, we decided, and knowledge in the university was not absolutely enough. We did not find any good answers in the university. And we thought that instead, why don't we bring the university in the camp? And we began to think really, what are the main terms that we can understand refugee camps today? And, we just recently published a book called Permanent Temporariness, and it was looking at our practice in the past 15 years. And in a sense, I would like us to reflect on these terms of permanent temporariness, and again, coming back to how can we understand refugee camps today, we tend to think that only permanency has value, and temporariness should be absolutely cured until it becomes temporary. And think about all refugees that are arriving to Europe. What is the promise that they are given? They are given the promise that they will become permanent residents. This is the whole, and they work all their life in order to become permanent resident. Yet, temporariness is a crucially very important part. If we will not give visibility, value, and importance to temporariness, we are canceling half of the history of our globe, if not even more. And in that sense, the whole idea, and I would say also a bit modern idea of understanding the world, is that we understand everything only through the eyes of permanency. We understand everything in that path, and we will encourage and push everybody to become permanent. And in that sense, by doing so, you will actually never understand what the camp is today. And let me only tell you one tiny story in order to explain what I am saying. You know, in the Haitian refugee camp, where I worked for 70 years, where they are living there for 70 years, I worked for 15 years, I was sitting together with some few women, and you know, there was, and they speak every day about the right of return. So it's a daily topic. It's not completely abstract. And they were chatting with one of the leaders of the camp. He arrived and they asked him, Abu Khalil, when we will be coming back home, all of us? And I have to say that the villages from where people from the Haitian are coming are only from 20 to 40 kilometers far away. So it's really a bus drive. And he says, no, we are working on this. And they say, but what else do we need? We have a bus. They bought a bus in the camp, for the camp, and they call it the bus of return. So they say, Abu Khalil, but we have already the bus of return, so we can all return back home. One of the women, with almost a sad voice, she asked Abu Khalil, but do you think we can also take the Haitian refugee camp together with us back? And this is crucial. No, it's 70 years. It's history. People have emotions. They have neighbors. They have life. And all what we are asking them in order to defend their right of return is to cancel 70 years of history and life in order to come back home. When you go to Palestinian refugee camps, they have no problem of telling you, we will abandon everything. We will delete everything in order to come back home. And I find this absolutely, and why they are doing this? Because it's permanency they are looking for. And you know, we were pushing certain women that built their own houses while their husbands were in prison. And they were telling us that they would destroy everything and come back home. And I was asking them, but why do you want to destroy everything and come back home? Why cannot you claim both permanency and temporariness? No, I mean, it can be, if you passed 70 years of life in temporariness, this deserves also to be written in history. So in that sense, what I am trying to say is that we should really revise everything and try to give value to what temporariness is today. And to the point that, you know, both my husband is Italian, and we went to live in Palestine, and we lived. I mean, we have never been granted family reunion. As Italian, the Israeli government never granted him any family reunion, so we had to live for 10 years illegally, and therefore temporariness. And yet, even if we are both PhDs, I was directing a department, he was a professor at the university, we were both feeling ourselves and our family as a permanent temporariness family. Our work has been all the time dealing with permanent temporariness. There are some people that living in the world, not necessarily born and die in the same place. Half of our globe is dealing with where home is. Yet we are still insisting to see the world only from a permanency point of view. And this is what we think the antibiotic of the world. If we would not change this, we will never understand displacement. We will never understand how to deal with camps and understand camps. And therefore, in order, our work has been all the time sort of struggling with this. And you know, when, for example, we established the university in the refugee camps, we were challenged by the community, and they say, you know, guys, you are architects. Why don't you, and we are only speaking, and I had to speak what? I'm almost finishing my time, if I finished my time. And I have been speaking for 15 minutes to speak about this condition of permanent temporariness and what we were trying to do in the university, in the refugee camp. So they say, you are architects. Why don't you build a university that would speak to this condition of permanent temporariness? And I have to admit that this was not an easy, it took us a while, but then at a certain point, we thought, why not? And we wanted to actually give form to this permanent temporariness. And finally, we built a concrete tent that is a tent made of concrete, because this is what refugee camp is about today. If you go to a 70 years of life in the Haitian refugee camp, you will find 7-floor concrete, yet, and it is their right, people are still claiming that they are living in concrete, in a tent, and they have to own both their temporariness and their permanency. So in that sense, for us, the people that are standing in front of a concrete tent and asking why a concrete tent today in the refugee camp, and under that concrete tent, we are organizing lessons, we are organizing in order to understand all what I was trying to tell you about. So for us, sometimes, and this is where I say it's very important to understand what are our strategies and how can we contribute into building a different ideology and different way of understanding refugee camps. And in that sense, I would end by this project, because what I am trying to say, and we actually design different projects in refugee camps, so if you are interested, you can go to our website and see more. But I want to end with this project, because since ever we have been working in refugee camps, to give value was our main concern, no? Because we felt that refugees themselves actually were undermining what they are building in exile, what they are building in displacement. Only the world we destroy everything and come back home hurts a lot, because means that you have again to displace yourself into a home that was there 70 years ago. So in that sense, we were understanding how can we relate to this? How can we give value to this display without, camps are crimes of humanity. So I want to make sure that we understand all this, that our position is that camps should have not been existing since the beginning. Camps are crimes of humanity, should not exist, yet they exist. How can we act towards this? How can we understand and give value to the life of people that are living there? And in that sense, one of the provocative projects we are doing right now is called Refugee Heritage. And the Refugee Heritage project is a project we are doing with the community in the Haitian refugee camp. And we are claiming the Haitian refugee camp as part of the World Heritage Sites, as part of UNESCO. And we are doing this as an art project, by the way, because refugees were very worried on how can we, because as it stands today, politically, we cannot go for it. But because we work between art, architecture, and pedagogy all the time, whenever we feel that there is a project that is impossible on the ground, we refuge in the art and try to understand if we can do it in the art. And in that sense, we are inviting experts from UNESCO, we are inviting people from the community, we are inviting architects. All what we can do in a normal life, we are doing inside the art venues in order for us to understand how much can we push forward. What does it mean today for temporariness to still be claiming value, and also to ask the simple question, why rights are only tied to permanency? Are temporary people that sometimes live all their life as temporaries, and by the way, all of us are temporary in this life. Maximum we can live 90 years, yet we think that we are immortal, and we think that the only history that needs to be written is the history of permanency. So in that sense, this is what we are trying to do, and I know it's a challenge, but I think that it's worth it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy. Could you show us a few pictures while we try to find some questions? Anybody who wants to start? Yeah.
Is it that, what kind of buildings do they make? Is it indeed that they reject improvements out of this temporality? Or is it something that you would say, well, the concrete tent could be improved in other ways?
I took yours. You're right. like to speak.
Trying to.
Does it work here, the website? If we...
No, it's not. I mean, I don't. Anyway, I mean, I will try to. I mean, if any one of you have visited already camps in the West Bank, and we are working especially with the communities of camps in the West Bank. People built actually a lot. It's if you would go there, you would feel that these camps are sort of part of the city, yet they are not part. And they have been all the time trying to understand how not to normalize their own life. And in that sense, they have been all the time a very strong politically engaged with what a camp and architecture is all about. So I think that what we find ourselves more doing in that thing is to understand how can we give certain special manifestation for it to speak about a condition that refugees wanted all the time to express through architecture. So the concrete tent, the refugee heritage. We also actually designed a school in Shofat refugee camp, which is on the border between, I mean, it's the only camp that is inside Israel. And, you know, when we designed the school, there was a big question of, is it beautifying the camp, or it is a way to understand how can we today still be struggling for our dignity and the right of return. So each wall you are building in these camps, especially in the West Bank, become a political discourse, right? And in that sense, I would say that we should never give up with the fact that refugees are sort of a failure of humanity, if we want to put it this way, and if they are there because we failed something, and it's not only about their problem, is how can we understand today the refugee phenomena as a big part of our globe today, rather than only to think about it as a way to solve. I mean, because the problem is that we look at them all the time as a state of exception. They are not state of exception, rather than they are posing the question on what kind of building today we are doing, and what kind of, are we still convinced? I mean, let me put it this way. If we will think about architecture symbols of displacement, is it possible to think beyond the containers that you obviously show and you are skeptical about, right? I mean, in that sense, why do we invite big star architects to actually give certain ideologies visibilities and certain mayors a vision for their cities, rather than architects would never engage with refugee camps, if not as a miserable place that needs to be reacted to and needs aid. And this is where I am saying that, you know, refugee camps are all over the place, and many of us that feels precarious today can identify with refugees. So and this is a potential to understand architecture today, to understand our cities today, and to act in a different manner. But in order to act in a different manner, we need a different mindset. And we need universities in refugee camps, and new knowledge and new understanding of how they deal with private and public, how they deal, what does that mean? So in that sense, maybe what I am trying to say is, you know, the concrete tent, the refugee heritage, the school that is actually in contradiction with the rest of the camp, is a way to say, can we as an architect engage today with the issue of displacement in a complete different manner, by actually really considering that it needs to be represented with our most creative ways, not as a way to aid them for 3 months or 6 months or a year, rather than to build a new way of thinking displacement through spatial manifestation. It is actually, I think it is what architects today, if we feel responsible socially and politically, this is where we should be. At least, I mean, this is what I give to myself as a responsibility of an architect. I would love to understand how I engaged beyond offering the refugees. It's a place where they can stay in okay way for 2 years rather than to engage in a stronger manner and to understand how we create identification, what does displacement today means, how many of us, I believe half of our globe are temporary permanent people today. I mean, that we live, we don't have home. So why do we actually project this only in refugees? What does it mean today to belong to the public space if I am here in the Netherlands? What does it mean for me? I don't know. Or either to assimilate to a Dutch behavior, or I am not, because one of the main rhetoric is that you arrive here and you should behave the way we tell you should behave. Are we still okay with our public space in this way, or we need, you spoke about, for example, refugees beginning from a park. What kind of park today we can think and understand that is able not only to bring people in to assimilate to one big Western culture, rather than able to include many cultures together? I personally am not sure it exists yet in Europe, and I think this is the challenge. And when we speak about refugee crisis, I don't think that we speak about housing crisis. I think that what we mainly speak about is public space crisis, because people are not yet ready to share public responsibilities, not really ready to share concepts around how can we collectively share public space. This is ours. Either you will involve in it the way we tell you, or you are out of it. If this is the case, segregation is the answer. So in that sense, what I'm proposing is that can we understand refugees throughout a different perspective, rather than one central big perspective where everybody needs to obey too.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Give her some applause. And now we come to our third and important speaker. We went to the future first, then we faced reality of today, and now we look back in history to a wonderful city, the biggest port city in Europe. And if we forget China, it would be the biggest port city in the world. And it has a Muslim mayor. It's Rotterdam. It's very diverse. Rotterdam was bombarded during the war and started flourishing after making certain decisions and reshaping the decisions of rebuilding Rotterdam. Today we have lots of areas, big cities, herbicide. You have Syria, you have Iraq, you have Yemen, if I only take the Middle East, the poor Middle East. And we need ways of, if we have some knowledge and wisdom about how we dealt with our post-war rebuilding, that would be great. So, shedding light on this is Michel Provost. Our third speaker is an architectural historian specialized in urban planning history, post-war architecture, and contemporary urban development. Provost co-founded the Office of Crimson Architectural Historians, engaged in research design projects in the fields of urban planning, architecture, and art. We see this art is always popping up. Provost is the director of the International Newtown Institute in Almere, the Netherlands, an international center for education and research relating to new towns, and is the head editor of the International Newtown Institute publications. Ms. Provost, the floor is yours. Also yours.
Well, thanks for the introduction, and it may seem a bit strange to suddenly switch to history and to Rotterdam. To my defense, I should say that I was asked to do so. To talk about this, what could be an example for other cities that need to be reconstructed, but also to give away the conclusion, I think the word context has been mentioned before in, for instance, Flora's talk. Context being so important in how you build, how you rebuild, how you reconstruct. And I think the physical example of Rotterdam as a reconstructed city is very, very limited. But I will try to tell the history of its reconstruction in 10 points that hopefully clarify why I think it is not replicable, and in what way its methods, the methods that are behind the reconstruction and the thinking behind it could be. And also I want to focus not so much on the process, as well as on the first years of reconstruction and on the way that it became a collective process. Because I think if you talk about examples, this could maybe be one of the few really concrete lessons that you could take from the reconstruction of Rotterdam. That this reconstruction needs to be a collective process, a collective project, and a collective counseling maybe. Rotterdam was bombarded. For all the Dutch people in this audience, this will be something rather known. Maybe it's not so well known that this is what Rotterdam looked like for a long period. So it was empty. It was used as an agriculture field. But the main important thing is that it was declared to be a tabula rasa. So tabula rasa is is one method that in urban planning was very popular, was very common in the post-war period. The notion that you would start with a clean slate and build something completely different and completely new. And this is something that, for all kinds of reasons, we don't do anymore. So the notion of identity and of history and the value of those things have become much more important and are underlying every kind of urban planning decisions nowadays. But in the time of the reconstruction of Rotterdam, this definitely was not the case. The bombardment. This is the city burning in May 1940. And I thought it was interesting that all these people that are on the field, which is quite close to the Boijmans and het Nieuwe Instituut, they look like a very sad population looking at their burning houses. But in fact, most of these people are people that came from the suburbs and went to the city center to look at the spectacle of the burning city. So there's a different side to every picture, I guess. But this tabula rasa it is important to realize that it wasn't caused by the bombardment. It was a conscious decision by the politicians, by the policymakers, and by the professional world. This is the law that was made just a little over a month after the bombardment, saying that all the land was the part of eminent domain. So it was onteigend. All the land of the city became the property of the city, so that it would be more easy to have a large-scale urban plan, and there would be no remnants of the former city. Because there were a lot of remnants. In fact, you could say that maybe 30% was still standing. And as you see these images, these buildings were quite present yet, still. Let me see. Like this station was almost, the roof is gone, but that's the same situation with the Lauwenskerk. Yet, with a kind of pleasure, you can see that just a few months after the bombardment, in the summer of 1940, these groups of men were organized, and they were tearing all the walls down. So that was the first decision that was made, and people often say that, yeah, it was the Germans who decided that our city had to be torn down. No, it wasn't the Germans. It was the German laws that made it possible. But it was actually the Dutch institutions that decided on this complete clearance of the city. So after all these guys torn down the walls, this is what it looked like. So a few buildings were remaining, amongst them the city hall that you saw before. Over here, the post office, so and the Lauwenskerk, and the rest was cleared and empty to receive the new ideas for the city. And these new ideas were made by the elite of the city. So this, and this again is something that I think you should realize, that this is a situation that doesn't exist like it did in that period. So there was an elite inside the city that started planning immediately, and it consisted of the private sector, of people with the power, people with the money, and the policymakers of the city. So it was a completely top-down affair. And they, they came up with, first of all, an official plan, a master plan for the whole city, and this was based roughly on the pre-war structure. So you can see some of the streets that are not completely straight, they're sort of crooked, they have little squares. So these are sort of remnants of the pre-war city. And it also reflected in the architecture. So the architecture also had a historic ring to it. Even though it was not rebuilt, the whole idea of the reconstruction at first was to maintain this recognizable image of pre-war Rotterdam. The image that people felt at home with, that they knew, so there would be a continuity with history. But this plan was soon thrown into the garbage bin, and a new version of this plan came about. And you could say that this wears very much the stamp of this entrepreneurial elite. You could even, you could say this is kind of entrepreneurial modernism, which doesn't have these kind of crooked streets, but it has straight streets. The traffic is becoming much more important. A rotunda for traffic is more important than a square for meeting. It was flexible to develop. All kinds of things that actually fit very well into an entrepreneurial look at the city. So this also meant that you could say the exploitation of the city, the way that this city would function, and that you could deal with it, and that you could also monetize it, was more important than the connection with history. And of course, the kind of architecture also reflected this. So there's no more gables, no more references to 17th century canal houses. There's international modernist architecture and cars. There is large scale, not any small scale buildings anymore. So it's a complete image of modernism and a conscious break with history. So of course this was, for the people who lived in Rotterdam, this was quite a shock. First, the bombardment had been a shock, and now also this modern image was a shock. So this is where you could say the collective counseling comes in. Just one more thing about this conscious break with history. Rotterdam took this step, but not all cities did that. And this also shows you that it is something that is related to context and that is different in every city. Even in the same country as the Netherlands, there was this other city of Middelburg, which was also completely destroyed, but where the planners took a different choice, which was to actually stick with these images of a more historic architecture, and where the rubble, the city was just as destroyed as in Rotterdam, was rebuilt, and now it still has this outlook of a historic city. And also in Germany, where you all know how Dresden was completely destroyed. And this is the Frauenkirche. This is before the war, and this is what it looks like now. And this is what it looked like in 1945. So there are choices that you can make about the connection and the relationship with the history of the city, and it depends on a lot of factors and a lot of vision and a lot of interpretation, which decision gets taken. Well, this is a very vague image, but it shows you that this collective counseling took a few phases for the Rotterdam population. And the therapy consisted, first of all, of a goodbye to the old city. And the policymakers also talked to their population, saying, think of the pre-war city. Wasn't it actually... well, they didn't really say rubbish, but they said, well, think of the old city. It wasn't that wonderful. Let's get over it. Let's be happy that we lost these kind of streets, this kind of poverty, these narrow streets that nobody wants to get back to. This is actually something that we should say goodbye to. And they would also say, think of Rotterdam as a city with a soul. And the soul is not in the form, it's not in the buildings. We haven't lost our soul with a bombardment. The soul of Rotterdam is modern, it's functional, it's raw. This is the soul of Rotterdam. The working, the harbor, the steel, the noise. And this is Rotterdam, where you have this train built right through the historic center, that would be impossible to think of in Amsterdam. But that's the soul of Rotterdam, or other streets that have been just cut through the urban fabric. So they were sort of comforting the Rotterdam population by saying, no, you haven't lost something important, and what you have lost is actually not worth anything. And then the second thing was, after this sort of mourning phase, there was acceptance. Acceptance of the fact that the old had gone, the old city was gone. There was just this blank slate, and there were poets who actually made poems proclaiming the beauty of the new city, and proclaiming the beauty of the miracle of the light of the new Rotterdam, which was so empty, and which had streets without houses that were laying open and empty into the horizon. And so there was a kind of a poetry, a ruined poetry, which I would call the phase of acceptance. And it was also made to see the population that they shouldn't despair. They shouldn't have any regrets, but they should see this destruction as a chance. And then there was the third phase of the counseling, which was welcoming the new city. And creating a feeling of the collective effort that the reconstruction was going to be. So there was this, now we would probably say it's city marketing, or it was public relations, but this welcoming the new city was accompanied by many campaigns and advertisements showing the public what this new city was going to be, and making them part of it also. So there was different exhibitions showing the audience Rotterdam straks, Rotterdam in the future, in which, of course, there was no participation at all. It was showing the audience what it was going to be. But so in this case, you see the urban planner who made the plans, just explaining to the public and getting their appetite up for what would be Rotterdam in the future. And this is the image that was, well, not particularly this image, but the metaphor of the phoenix from the ashes. that was used all the time. Rotterdam would arise again as a phoenix, the mythological bird that renews itself from the ashes. And there were poems, there were posters. It was all over the place. And this was like the mantra for the population of Rotterdam to start believing in this new future. And then there were, of course, these tours. So there were buses where you could get a tour, and you would drive around through the new Rotterdam and look at the new buildings and the new architecture, which all showed this the new modern image of the city. And it was full of billboards saying "aan de slag, Rotterdammers," which means let's get to work. So again, this is the collective effort that is being organized. And I think the psychological conclusion, the effects, the consequences of it have been quite immense. But I would say in the case of Rotterdam, it's not just about rebuilding, it's not about creating new buildings and streets and physical things. And it's also not only about Rotterdam. This reconstruction would have never happened the way it did if it had it not been for different factors, which was, for instance, that Rotterdam had the ambitions and has become the main harbor in the Netherlands and in the world even. So it was the moneymaker of the Netherlands. So it needed to be rebuilt as a counterpart of the harbor. Also, an important fact behind the making of this collective was the collective enemy. So this image, of course, shows the German, the MOF, as the collective enemy that sort of binded this collective together. And another binding factor was the Marshall help. So the money coming from the US, connecting the Netherlands to the US, to this part of the Western world. Uncle Sam pushing this little Dutch farmer up the hill to a better future. So there was the geopolitical side of the reconstruction of Rotterdam is part of its context. So it's not only about the city itself. And I think in these kind of billboards that you see now at this moment in Rotterdam, which says, hoor, hier bonkt het nieuwe hart van Rotterdam. Here the new heart of Rotterdam pounding. Actually shows the success of this collective campaign that started after the war. Before the war, this whole notion of Rotterdam, handen uit de mouwen, always working, always this active attitude was not present at all. It is a fabrication, and it is still working. So I think if you look at these very context-specific 10 points of Rotterdam, then you also immediately see the difference with the cities that we have been talking about, that we have mentioned in Syria or in Yemen or in Iraq. It is hard to imagine these cities cutting off the relation with their history, with their past, because they're so much defined by their past, by their thousands-year-old ancient history. And it is also easy to see that there is new geopolitical influences that will that will definitely play their part in the reconstruction of cities, for instance, in Syria, as we can already now see that the Emirates and Dubai especially are lining up to finance the economy of Syria, who are already making plans for the reconstruction of parts of Aleppo, for instance. And another thing is that this idea of the reconstruction era as a collective effort really worked very well in Rotterdam. Also because it created work, it created relations between different groups of people, between workers and thinkers, between poorer and middle class and richer, etc. But that was, of course, a lot easier in the Netherlands than in war-torn Syria, where especially the different groups and the differences between these groups have been at the start, at the roots of all the war. So there are very, very different situations. The context is very, very specific, and actually, I would say that goes for any city that needs to be reconstructed. So that is why I think only in this background idea of it is possible for architecture to be used as a way to create the collective and in a collective effort, but that's about all I would say. Not very hopeful.
Yes, hopeful. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I think this is not a question, but I think understanding the past and analyzing other things and this process of healing, I think these are hopeful. Is having tools. It doesn't have to like be one-on-one.
No.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Any questions about Rotterdam or post-war building?
Thank you, Michelle. Really interesting and an eye-opener also in many ways. What I don't understand yet is you said that the master plan was the creation of the elite, but the reconstruction was a collective effort. Did the elite decide to make it a collective effort? Did people rise up and take the thing into their own hands? How did that transition from the plan by the elite to the actual collective character happen?
Well, I think the elite character of this master plan has actually continued until, well, maybe until the beginning of this century. So that was sort of the normal way to go for any urban planning effort. But there was a conscious decision to involve as many people of the population, not only because it was necessary and because workers were needed, but also because the Dutch government knew very well that there was a risk in not including people because of the situation in Greece, where there was a civil war between with the communists, because of France, which had been torn by the war situation between the North and the South, because of, well, there were many more countries in Western Europe that actually fell to civil war-like situations. And this collective effort and the harmony of society was definitely something that was pushed and safeguarded by the Dutch government. But of course, it is also in a normal capitalist or social democratic system as we had then, it was normal that there would be a lot of work coming from a reconstruction project like this. There was just an immense amount of buildings that needed to be built, so there was work, so there was money to be made, and therefore everyone could have this perspective of my life will improve in due time, which was a positive thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll be very brief. My question is a bit connected to the previous one, but I would expand it a bit and connect it to the notion of geopolitics, what you mentioned. And in my research, I analyzed the influence of geopolitics in the reconstruction of Sarajevo in the 90s. And the geopolitics after the war, the Russians, the Arabs, the Turks came back, Europe. And so in this whole mess, the collective process disappeared, which was somehow formalized even in the socialist system. So, but how was it actually in Rotterdam? Did this sort of geopolitics beyond this sort of monetization and the port is coming, bringing you money, but did geopolitics through cultural influences also somehow was manifested in the reconstruction process? So the connection between culture, geopolitics, reconstruction.
Well, I think it's a good question because in my preparation for tonight, I was also thinking like, how is it possible that there was such a large consensus actually for the reconstruction? Because it was quite dramatic. And there was a lot of things were also not possible because they were completely guarded by the master plan. And yeah, it was very structured and organized, and there was hardly any debate. Were there no critical voices? Was there no these things like what does the influence of the Marshall help? What does it have on our society? Because you could predict that this Marshall help led to the to a more intimate relation with the US, which actually happened. And the industrialization of the Netherlands was very much stamped and identified with American companies. But this was not discussed at all, except for by the communists. And of course, we all know that they, in the beginning of the 50s or so, they sort of fizzled out and they were not heard really. So they were the only ones. And then there were some anarchists and some artists. But artists are always in the sort of the innocent corner. And so this debate was not heard. And I looked very hard for critics of the Reconstruction, and I didn't find them.
Thank you. Now I will ask our three speakers for a very, very short, please, Almarri and Hilal and Michelle. I'm going to ask you all one thing. I want you to suggest each a toolkit for the world as architects.
A toolkit?
Toolkit.
For what? For the world?
To make the relating to displacement.
Yeah.
A short, small toolkit. We're going to. This is our goodie bag, doggy bag, when we go home. Almarri, you mentioned that there was also a discussion with a minister from Jordan. Asked, could we have a toolkit that can help us? How can we? The idea is, what kind of ideas we could together work on? They can also be narratives or stories or concrete things. How can we have a little toolkit to take with us home? Ideas that we could really work on. Would you like to start?
Well, we talked a lot about the social issues, the context, the cultural questions, the philosophical way of is something permanent or is something temporarily. Like Rotterdam, of course, you can rebuild it because you know it will be permanent. It's a different question. But I think if you look at the toolbox, the way the minister asked me, she said, we'll have this influx of people, we need answers now. And I think maybe that part of the question can be answered with smart building technology, so at least that you can give them cover. And from there you can start to rethink, okay, what is the society? Where can you improve qualities? In what way do you improve qualities? But it starts with food and then the rest will follow. But you have to start somewhere. And then I think the toolbox is something almost like a first aid kit. That's something you will need too.
I would say actually, I would departure from knowledge, certainly, because for me it is the base for any equal society, if we are still thinking about equal societies in the future. And I believe that, how can we share knowledge today is very important. How can we accept unlearning and learning together as a way of understanding the world? How can we break certain hegemonies through knowledge production is for me what I would take with me.
I would like to look at the invisible instruments and regulations and laws that are behind the persistence of permanence in our cities. Because I think there is a connection between the history of the welfare state and the focus on the permanence in the built environment, because it has to do with safety, with knowing that you can live in a house for a prolonged time, with being for the same amount of rent. So this kind of safety and permanence is built into our regulations, and for good reasons. But now that we have cities that are being lived in by expats, by international students, by refugees for shorter times, for a year or for 3 months, etc., these kind of regulations are in the way. And so I'm curious to see how we can use that to make cities, well, cities of comings and goings, where people actually don't stay for the rest of their lives, but have the freedom to move in and out.
Maybe if I can add something to what I meant with this first aid kit is, I once spoke to a guy who was working in African cities in the slum areas, and he had a very interesting observation. He said one of the first things is fire safety. He said in these areas, if there's a fire, the entire area burns. And he said the first things we do is organizing a fire lane through the slums. And he said we always make sure that these fire lanes connect to the existing city. And as soon as you have an open fire lane, he said we don't have to do anything else. Then immediately shops will come, because then you have a kind of main street, shops will come. And kind of urbanism emerges. So it's a very simple urban system that you implement, and then society takes over. It's almost self-organizing once you have set in basic systems. But make it possible for people to evolve, to set up their own social systems.
We've heard 3 different talks, future, present and past, and we all look at the future from 3 different approaches. It was like eating a full cream cake. They are very important questions and heavy. They don't have a simple question, unfortunately. But I think this 3 different perspectives and the hope that we have is what will keep us happy. It is, for me, it's my permanency, is in how you stay alive, how you stay hopeful. And we thank you very, very much. Sandy Hilal, Flourish Almere, and Michel Provost, please give them an applause. Thank you very much. And thank you. Drinks downstairs, and you can save the world downstairs. Thank you.